Hi and welcome to this third part in a series of videos on pfSense. And in this video we'll install and do a basic configuration of pfSense both on a physical and virtual machine. So let's get started. Right, well it's finally time to install pfSense at last. So I'm sure you know if you've decided if you're going to install pfSense on a dedicated computer or as a KVM virtual machine on unRAID. And in this video we're going to do both. So what we're going to need is the install media, so let's go and download that. We need to head across to www.pfsense.org/download and download the latest stable version for AMD 64-bit. And don't worry, it says AMD, it doesn't mean it's just for AMD CPUs, it just means it's the 64-bit version. And just on a side note, if you've ever wondered why you see things to download, a 32-bit version it says i386 and the 64-bit says AMD 64, well that's because with 32-bit it's based off Intel's 80386 instruction set. And for the 64-bit, well AMD invented the 64-bit extension to the x86 instruction set architecture. So after selecting the 64-bit version, we then need to choose which type of install media that we want. And we have the option of an ISO installer or of a USB installer. For a physical pfSense machine, you'd probably want to use a USB installer, unless you'd rather use the ISO image and burn it to a CD. But I think that nowadays using a USB installer is the way to go, and besides my physical pfSense box, well it doesn't have a CD drive at all. However, if you're installing pfSense as a VM, then download the ISO image, as that's what we'll be using. So next we have to choose the download location, so choose the location nearest to you, and for me that's Germany, and then click on to download. Okay, so once you've downloaded the files, we're going to need to decompress them. And you can see here that they have a file extension of .gz, and this type of file can be natively decompressed in both OS X and Linux. However, in Windows to decompress these files we have to use a program called 7-zip. So download that and install that, and then you'll be able to extract the files okay. Now just to make things easier, I've renamed the files to ISO pfSense and to memstick pfSense. So what I'm going to do now is to move the ISO image pfSense installer to the shared directory on my unRAID server, ready to be used to install the VM pfSense a bit later. And so the memstick pfSense installer needs to be flashed to a USB flash drive. And to do that we use a great little program called Etcher. And the good thing about Etcher is not only being open source, but it's also cross-platform, being available for Windows, Mac OS X and Linux. So download and install that for whichever OS you're using, and then we need to run the program and select the memory stick installer for pfSense. Then we need to select our drive to flash it onto, and if we don't have a USB drive connected it's going to ask us to connect one, and then when we do it will be detected and continue. And then we just click on flash to create the USB flash drive. And as this program is cross-platform, let's let it finish off on Mac OS and then we'll carry on from there. And after Etcher's flashed it, it will then validate the file to check everything's been done correctly. Okay, so the flash is complete, so let's close the program. But let's quickly check the drive ourselves in Disk Utility, and we can see here it's a FreeBSD partition, and that's because pfSense is based off FreeBSD. So, we have the physical pfSense machine install USB stick created, and earlier I moved the ISO image onto my unRAID server. So that means we're ready to start the install. So we're going to do this in three parts. First, how to install on a physical pfSense machine, but we're going to stop when we get to the install screen. Then secondly, we're going to go over installing the same on a VM, and then again stopping at the install screen. Then thirdly, we're going to go from the install screen and go right through the install of pfSense, as this part will be the same on both physical machine and virtual machine, so we'll do it together. So let's install pfSense on our physical machine. And let's plug in the USB install drive that we just created. But before we boot it, let's just check our BIOS settings. Make sure things like quick boot and fast boot are disabled, and especially disable secure boot. If you've added a PCI Express LAN card into your box, then I'd recommend disabling the internal LAN on the motherboard. And of course we have to enable the USB device to be the default boot device, or we can just press something like F12 and then select it from a one-time boot menu. Then the pfSense installer will start to load, and then we'll come to a blue copyright and distribution notice. And so for now, this is as far as we'll go on the physical install. And next we're going to install to the same point on a VM pfSense install, after which we'll carry on the installation, which is generic to both. Okay, so now let's move on to setting up pfSense as a KVM VM on unRAID. So first we need to take our PCIe Ethernet card and put it in the server. Okay, so with the network card installed into the server, let's have a look at the unRAID network settings. And we can see here that this network card's now being used by unRAID. Well, we don't want to have that happen, so what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to stub this so unRAID doesn't use it when it boots. So for that we need to go onto Tools and then go to System Devices, and I can see mine's here. So what we need to do, we need to look for the ID number of the network card, and for me here that is 8086:10BC, and you can see that's the same for each port of the network controller. So let's copy that and then go back to the main tab and then click onto Flash, and we're going to make an addition to the syslinux configuration file. So in your syslinux configuration file, under your menu default, on the line here where it says append, just after the append type vfio -pci.ids equals, and then we're going to paste the number we just copied, the ID number of the network controller, and then put another space and then click apply. And for this to take effect we have to reboot the server. But before we do, let's just check the IO MMU groups of the network card, because as you probably know, to pass through any PCIe device it must be in its own IO MMU group. And you can see my network controllers here. The 4-port card has been split into 2 IO MMU groups of 2 ports each, and there's a PCI bridge in each group as well. Now normally you'll find that if there are any other devices in the same IO MMU group with the device that you want to pass through, then it will not work. However, actually with a PCI bridge it normally will pass through anyway, so how mine is here would be okay. But if your grouping's different, then you may need to try and break up the devices if you can. And the easiest thing to try is using the ACS override patch. And we need to go to Settings, then VM Manager, and then toggle the view from basic to advanced view, and then down at the bottom here we can enable the PCIe ACS override patch. So just change that to yes and then click apply. But if that still doesn't break up your devices enough, then please have a look at my other video, how to break up IO MMU groups. Now if you're watching this video in the first week of it being uploaded, then that video won't be available, but if you're watching it after that time, then you'll see the video in the link above. Okay, so now it's time to reboot the server for all these changes that we've just made to take effect, so let's do that now. Okay, so now the server's rebooted, let's go back and look at our network settings. And now you can see my 4-port card is no longer being used by unRAID. Now let's quickly go back to Tools and System Devices and have a look at our IO MMU groups after the ACS override patch has been applied. And now we can see my network card here, and now although it didn't matter before, we can see that the PCI bridge is now not in the same group. And there's one thing I'd just like to say, is please don't use the ACS override patch unless you need to. The only reason I've done it in this video is just to demonstrate how it can break up the groups. So always try to get things working first without it. Right, so it looks like we're ready now to actually make the VM and get everything going. So let's click onto the VMs tab and let's scroll down and add a new VM, and we're going to click on the FreeBSD template and we need to give it a name, and I'm going to call mine pfSense tutorial, and I'm going to give it the pfSense logo for the icon, So next we're going to choose how many cores of our CPU we're going to pass through. And I'm only going to pass through 1 core for now. And next we're going to choose how much memory we're going to give to pfSense, and I'm going to choose 3 gigs. Now remember, at any time you can come back here and adjust these. If you want to give it a few more CPU cores or a little more or less memory, you can do that. Leave the machine type on Q35, and we're going to use OVMF BIOS. And now we need to find the pfSense install ISO that we downloaded earlier and select that. Now we need to give the VM a virtual hard drive, and I'm going to choose a 20 gig one. But I'm going to use a QCOW2 image, so that will only use as much space as what is being used by the VM. And we need to change the primary VDisk bus here and change that to SATA. Now later on we can actually change that to VirtIO, but during the install it must be on SATA. And graphics card VNC, I'm going to delete the password out of the VNC password here. And now I'm going to add in my Intel NIC. But I'm just going to do untick start VM after creation, and then click on to create. Now we're going to just edit the XML template because I want to remove the virtual network adapter. So we need to click up the top right here into form view and scroll down, and we can see here where it says interface type equals bridge and then a MAC address here. This part of the XML is the network card, so we need to delete everything between the interface and interface here. We need to delete that, and then scroll down and click update, and you'll see if we go back now, there's no virtual network adapter here. Okay, so now it's time to start up the VM and then go to VNC remote, and now the pfSense installer is booting up and we're at the copyright and distribution notice screen. So that's the end of the part that is specific to installing pfSense on a VM. Okay, so now let's move on to the next part, because the installation from here onwards is identical both on a physical pfSense machine and a virtual pfSense machine. So just hit enter to accept the copyright and distribution notice, and press enter again to install pfSense. And you can just press enter here to continue with the default key map unless you want to change your keyboard settings. And then press enter for a guided disk setup, and pfSense will install itself. And the installation is now finished, so just press enter for no, and now we just want to reboot. If you're on a VM you don't have to do anything other than press reboot. If you're using a physical machine, then now's the time to remove the USB installer. Okay, and so pfSense is rebooting. Okay, so now pfSense is loaded, and you can see here it's already assigned my WAN and my LAN to 2 different network ports. I don't actually know which ones it's assigned it to, so now I'm going to press 1 to assign the interfaces myself, and press enter. And we don't need to set up any VLANs at the moment, so click N and then enter. And now it's asking us to assign the WAN interface, and this is the interface which will plug into our modem. And so to auto detect it, we need to type A and then press enter. And now we need to plug in the RJ45 cable going from our modem into one of the LAN ports on our server. Then once plugged in, just press enter to continue. And you can see it's detected the link up on EM3. So now we need to do the same for the LAN interface. So now I'm going to plug the network cable that comes from a network switch and plug that one in. And then press enter. And plugging in this cable has been detected on interface EM2. Now we don't need to detect an optional interface, so we're finished now, so just press enter. So now we need to press Y to confirm this configuration and continue. Okay, so now we're ready to pop in the IP address and then log into pfSense. Now we need to make sure that our computer we're logging into pfSense on is in the same network range as the 192.168.1.1. And of course it goes without saying, make sure that computer is plugged into the network switch which the LAN port on pfSense is plugged into. Okay, so let's log into the pfSense web UI. And the first thing we're going to see is the message saying our connection's not private. Now that's to be expected, so just click onto advanced and click proceed to the IP address anyway. And now we need to put in the pfSense username and password. the username is admin, and the password is pfSense. So then we'll be greeted with the setup wizard, so just click onto next and next again, and here we can choose the host name for our router, and here we have the option to set some DNS servers. If we don't set any here, it'll use the ISP assigned DNS, so I'm going to set the Cloudflare DNS for mine, and I'm going to uncheck override DNS and click next, and now we need to just set our time zone and click next. And now here we have to configure what type of WAN IP interface we have. Now most people will probably use DHCP with their modem, but I use a BT VDSL connection, so I'm going to use PPPoE. And so here I've put my broadband provider's username and password in. Now the only difference if you'd chosen DHCP for your modem type is you just wouldn't fill in the PPPoE configuration information. You'll just carry on and then press next. And here we can change the IP address of the router if we want to. I'm going to leave it as it is. And now we need to just change the admin password from the default one. And then click next. And now we just need to click onto reload. So let's just click here to continue to the web UI. And now we just have to accept that we're not going to commercially distribute this. And that brings us onto the pfSense dashboard. And you can see here now on my WAN I've got a public IP address, even though I have obscured it out a little bit. So now we should find that the internet's working, so let's just open a web page. Okay, and so the internet's working fine. But if you have an unRAID server on your network and you're using HTTPS to connect to it, then you're going to find that you're not going to be able to access the web UI. Now you see I'm trying to log into my unRAID server here, and it's saying this site can't be reached, and I'll just show you why. For that we need to just go to System, and then go to Advanced, and then just scroll down a bit, and you see here this setting. By default, pfSense protects against DNS rebinding attacks. Now of course your unRAID server isn't doing any type of attack and it is perfectly secure. It's just the way the HTTPS is working. It has to resolve back to a local IP address, but we don't want to actually disable this on our pfSense firewall either. So we're not going to disable it because it's important to leave these checks on. But what we need to do is we need to go to Services and then go to our DNS resolver and scroll down and click on Display Custom Options and put in the following text and then click Save. And now we need to click Apply Changes for that to take effect. And now if I go back to the tab where my unRAID server is and click Refresh, I can now get to the web UI. Okay, so let's go back to the dashboard and we'll just go through a few basic settings before finishing up this video. Okay, so just looking at the dashboard how it is here, the first thing I'm going to do is look at my CPU type. And because my CPU supports AES-NI, yet it's inactive, I'm going to enable that in pfSense. So let's go onto System, and then click onto Advanced, and then go to Miscellaneous. And then if we scroll down, here where it says Cryptographic and Thermal Hardware, I'm going to select this to be AES-NI based acceleration. Now this here thermal sensors, if you're using a physical pfSense machine, then choose either Intel or AMD. And also if you're using a physical pfSense machine, then enable the Power D. This will give you much better power efficiency, as pfSense then will be able to control the CPU frequency. However, if you're using a VM, there's no point in enabling this because the CPU frequency is controlled by the host. So let's click Save, and next let's click onto Networking. Now by default, IPv6 is enabled on pfSense. But I don't want it on my network, so I'm going to uncheck this box here. And let's scroll down to the bottom of the page, and here where we have network interfaces, we can disable hardware checksum offload. Now why would we want to do this? Well, good network cards, and that's why Intel ones are recommended, they have chips on the card itself that do checksum calculations, and this makes it easier on the CPU. But if you're not using Intel NICs, then the chances are the card will not do a good job at this, so it's better to disable having the network card do this altogether. And also, when using virtual network adapters in a VM pfSense, in addition to the pass-through 4-port NIC, for which there are use cases where we may do this, then we'd also disable the hardware offload. But for me now, I'm not going to disable this for my setup. Okay, so moving on, now let's click Save. Okay, next let's just go to Admin Access, I'm going to change the protocol to HTTP because I don't always want a warning from my browser when I log in. If you don't want your browser to automatically remember the username and password for pfSense, then uncheck this. I'm going to leave it as it is. And I'd highly recommend enabling SSH login. So here click on Enable Secure Shell and click Save. Okay, so now let's just enter the IP address in again. Now if you have trouble logging in as I am, having changed from HTTPS to HTTP, then you're going to have to clear your browser's cache and log in again. Okay, so we can see these changes have taken effect. The AES is enabled and also we're logging in with HTTP. But just before I end this video, I'm just going to show you an error that you may possibly have. And I believe this error has only been occurring since the recent update of pfSense. And this is actually really easy to fix. All we have to do is go onto System, Advanced, and then Firewall and NAT, and then if we just scroll down, and then we just change the firewall maximum table entries from 20,000 to 40,000, and then click Save. And now everything should be fine. So this video is long enough I think, so that brings us to the end of it. Now you should have a basic working pfSense install. And in the future videos we'll start configuring some more advanced features. I think the next video will set up multiple VPN clients so we can route any device on our network through any VPN endpoint. Plus we'll look at how to also exclude devices from the VPN for things such as Plex and games consoles. Now I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it useful. If you did, then please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And I'd like to give a really big thanks to all of my Patreons who really help make these videos possible. You guys are awesome. Anyway, it's time for me to go, and whatever you're up to for the rest of the day, I hope it's good, and I'll catch you next time.